Hi, it's Arjun. This week's video is a follow-up to last week's post titled, What Does Energy Pragmatism Mean for Climate and Sustainability? And we wanted to expand on some of the key points we made in that post using our own voice, and also to address some of the questions and pushback that we received last week. And our key messages are threefold. First, that energy pragmatism means a return to energy's natural hierarchy of needs, both from policymakers, investors, corporations, everyone out there. All anyone cares about anywhere on Earth is energy available and reliable, full stop. That's what they care about. And we no longer have that inverted hierarchy of needs that pretended that carbon emissions is the objective. That's not to say it doesn't matter, but it is no one's primary objective. The second point is, what does all this mean for investment flows into non-fossil fuel, non-oil, gas, and coal energy? And how is that impacted or not by what I'm going to call the whims of Western world virtue signaling? You're either for climate action over the last 4 years, now you're anti-woke in this new environment, cutting through all that noise. What does it actually mean for investment flows into especially new energies? And then the last point is, all of this is going to be driven by the wants, needs, desires, and investment plans and policies of the other 7 billion people on Earth, starting with, the 4-odd billion people in Asia, and then ideally folks in Africa and Latin America as well. And it is going to be their policies and plans and investments that do drive the future of energy. As a reminder, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, there is a video that you can find on YouTube, Substack, or on the Verdin website. And for the weeks I don't produce a video podcast, there is a written post that, again, you can find on Substack and on the Verdin website. So let me start with a very quick recap of last week's post. And the first one is, how do we define energy pragmatism? There's been a lot of talk, maybe too much talk about it, especially at the CERAWeek conference, where literally every panelist or person that we heard mentioned the term a return to pragmatism, realism, and balance in the energy conversation. It's where I'd like to think we have been all along, and it's great to see the world come our way. But what does it actually mean? And to us, it means the world recognizes that prioritizing energy availability and reliability is all anyone cares about at all times, followed by affordability and geopolitical security. But you'll always take energy being there and being reliable over what you pay for it. You don't care as much about where it comes from so long as you have it. Once you satisfy that you have it and it's reliable, you then start layering in things like affordability and geopolitical security. And it's only after those, I'm going to call it, critical basic needs are met that luxury beliefs around the environment and climate and these kind of things can be taken into account. Then the natural follow-up for folks who are especially passionate about addressing climate concerns is, does that mean, is what you just said, does that mean that environmental goals take a back seat to improving GDP growth in the economy and energy availability? I'm going to say the answer is a hard no. Clean air, clean water, 100% correlated with societal wealth. It's not even a close call. Things like women's rights, also positively correlated with energy usage and economic gains. If you are pro-energy growth, you are pro-women. The question is, but how does climate fit into that specifically, and climate concerns? And I say this, I see no evidence from anyone anywhere that they actually prioritize CO2 reductions over those basic needs. An example I've used it many times, is Germany. When Russian gas was cut off, there's no evidence that German citizens, A, celebrated the coming carbon reduction thanks to the loss of Russian gas, or spent even 5 seconds thinking about, what is the carbon footprint of the LNG we now need to import, or the LNG or the coal that we're going to start burning? The first thing they did is they got energy availability back. They paid whatever they could for it from wherever they could buy it. And they did so also by using coal. People care about availability and reliability. There's no reason to pretend otherwise. So then the question arises, if you are a self-declared energy pragmatist, how much warming are you okay with? That's a question posed by those who are, I'm going to say, sincerely concerned about emissions and the warming and all that kind of stuff. And I just say, it's not the correct question to this person. And what I mean by that is, all of us who are in that lucky 1 billion club, Americans like me, Western Europeans, Canadians, Japanese, Australian, New Zealand. I think we have to include South Korea in this bucket as well, by the way. It's not going to be up to us. It is up to the other 7 billion people to decide how they're going to develop their economies and what energy sources they're going to use. The colonial era ended with World War II. We can have opinions on it. We can say, I favor this policy or this energy source or some other avenue of opportunity. It is going to be up to them. Where I gain optimism is that if you've got a billion-person scale economy and you do not have sufficient quantities of crude oil or natural gas, you are going to be highly motivated to crack the code on the new stuff. You're already seeing some progress in a country like China. Now, they're using a whole bunch of coal to create EVs and other things, so we can debate how, quote, clean or carbon, we can debate the carbon intensity of some of their transition, but you're seeing a very strong motivation to limit oil imports. I'm going to talk about that later on about India. And I actually, perhaps counterintuitively, have the belief that the stronger EM growth is, the more likely and the more pressure there will be to figure out the alternatives. And that's a very different mindset or framework than the last 4 or 5 years of we have to have net zero and we have to have strong industrial policy. And we have to have these very strict rules and regulation to get carbon out of our energy. That is not a path that is leading to success. To me, it seems painfully obvious. We need a new way. And that new way is going to be driven by recognizing that energy and carbon and the climate and the environment and cost of supply is going to be driven by the needs of the other 7 billion people on Earth based on what they want to do, not what we think they should do. So is decarbonization and such policies a total non-starter? It's not a non-starter. I think in the developed world, I look at an area like methane emissions, where we've developed a whole bunch of technology and have a lot of understanding. This, to me, is an increasingly solvable problem. I support near zero methane by 2030. We can debate the specific rules and regulations and how you'd go about it. But as a general objective, that is, I'm going to call it a fixable issue. And there are other examples like that. For the developing world, again, I'll keep coming back to it. It is going to be that geopolitical angle and to some degree an affordability angle driven by capital flows to avoid the importation of energy sources that you don't control. And that to me is going to be the driver of, quote, decarbonization. That's a very different perspective than we need to believe in net zero by round number of years and have a whole bunch of industrial policy to get there. That is something I'm far more skeptical of. So is net zero by 2050 dead or deferred? To be dead, you would at one point had to have been alive. So it certainly, I will say, is a catchy slogan. I think it's had a marketing effect to raise awareness if this was needed for carbon emissions and dealing with the issue. If that was the purpose, then you can actually argue it's had some success. But as actual policy matter, to me, it's never made sense as a defining objective for society or, for that matter, individual companies. I'm going to talk about sort of the corporate response to this old slogan towards, I think it's probably the last slide of this deck. So let me shift to what does energy pragmatism mean for investing in, quote unquote, climate and new energies? And let me just start with some views on language used. These terms green, clean, and climate tech, they are nonsense and inaccurate phrases. And the problem with them is they connote some notion of sort of good versus evil. No such thing when we're talking about energy sources. The idea that fossil fuels are bad and that somehow, quote, green investment is good has been a big part of the problem, a big part of the divisiveness. All energy sources have positive and negative attributes on a whole range of factors, from how much do you have domestically, how much do you have to import, what is the cost of supply, what is the reliability? How does that reliability differ in different regions? How does the cost of supply differ? There are a whole host of attributes. And I think the energy narrative would be well served to rid themselves of this sort of green, clean, and climate tech type jargon. All energy, it's certainly true of oil and gas. I've lived it for 33 years. It is also true of the new stuff, is boom bust. And there's a pragmatism to that point. Way too much attention is paid to especially who is US president, what is their administration saying about specific policies, and you can always debate policies and say, well, I like this one or don't like that one. The decision and the cycles around energy, both old and new, are well beyond any one country's, even one as important as the United States, their president or leader or their administration. It is a boom bust sector. Both, all areas are boom bust. And understanding those capital cycles, the return on capital cycles, free cash flow growth, it's what I've spent my career doing. It applies to the new stuff just as it applies to the old stuff. We spend way too much time talking about political policies and R's versus D's, especially in the US. Many public company business models have actually been quite challenged. So I'll show a graph in a moment, but there's actually been a growth to some of the new energy stuff, especially the example I'll show is solar, which hasn't necessarily translated into public company business models. There's private equity models, there's venture capital models, there's public company models. Some are good, some are not good. I think understanding how and where these things are worthy of investment, and this is true of oil and gas as well. There are good business models and bad business models. It's as important to understand that and spend time on that than it is to necessarily debate whether the IRA is a good thing or should be repealed or any other aspect of most of our discussion. There are two aspects to, I'm going to call it specifically the quote carbon emission and climate discussion. The first is the regulatory piece. So when we think about things like methane mitigation, I'm trying to get to near zero methane by 2030 or some other year. That is something that likely requires some amount of rules. Now, ideally, an industry can self-regulate itself, perhaps through its dominant trade body. That would be a great place to start. And plenty of rules around drilling wells and completing wells and so forth. The industry has a bunch of safety and health standards that are viewed as best practices and so forth. In the absence of that, it'll be government regulation. It's going to be one or the other. You don't want the government regulation, self-regulate yourself. This is a solvable problem, methane specifically. And I think caring about the carbon intensity, especially of our natural gas and LNG, it is something that is going to matter over the long term. It might not matter over the next 3.5 years. It did sort of matter over the last 4 years. When we look at the next 40 years, LNG projects are long-term in nature. I'm going to venture to say the US oil and gas industry and the Canadian oil and gas industry would be well served to handle methane, given that it is a very addressable problem for the most part today with technology and the cost understanding we have. The absence of that, you're looking at government regulation down the road. It may not be in the next 3 years. I think for new energies, there's been so much focus on policy. And all I'd say is no new energy is ever going to ramp if all it's doing is dealing with CO2. I'm going to use green hydrogen as the poster child for this. It always seemed like a ludicrous type of technology to me. I could not understand how Western Europe had such aggressive, quote, green hydrogen growth plans to displace Russian gas. I think people are starting to wake up to how preposterous some of those ideas were. But what technologies are going to ramp up? I'm going to use the term subsidy-free. There's always fiscal regimes that one has to take into account, but you need real economics. Those are the businesses that are exciting, and that does include some new stuff. It does include some old stuff, and that's how we evaluate energy. Too much focus on who is president, not enough focus on business models and real economics. Let me go through a few slides here that hopefully illustrate some of these points. I've showed some of these graphs before. So this is 5 different, I'm going to call them new energies companies. It's a little bit Europe skewed, but I think the point still holds. I think the first thing I'd just say is just a couple observations here. So we're coming off a 4-year period, which was as strongly, quote, climate focused, especially in the US under the Biden administration, certainly true in Europe. And what happened? It was nothing but a straight line down for everything associated with, quote, new energies or the old terms, clean tech. They peaked before Biden, right about the time of Biden's inauguration, right after election, but I think a couple days before his inauguration. This is this peak here in 2021. So before anything he did, before the IRA and all that came with it, and all the policy support and all the nice words, it was this, these are all publicly traded companies. And let's look here. They actually had outperformed leading into the Biden administration. Now, I don't remember who was president from 2017 to 2020, or if they had a strong view on new energy or not. But my point would simply be, and apologies for being sarcastic, way too much attention is paid to who is president in these things. 4 best years for new energy were under Trump. The 4 worst years were under Biden. That's the opposite, essentially, of what each administration rhetorically said. But then lo and behold here, in the last 1.5 years, we've seen 2 companies. This is Siemens and GE Vernova, have very good stock performance, where I believe it's their gas turbine businesses and the recognition of that opportunity that's driving those equities. But at least in the case of GE Vernova is newly traded, Siemens had struggled here, as did other new energies, and it's now found. And it's, again, point being, business models. What are these companies doing? What are their returns on capital? What is their inherent profitability? That is what is driving these stocks, not whether the current administration is speaking nicely or poorly about them, or frankly, even enacting their policies. Let's look at solar. This one really jumps out to me. So the inset here is solar generation. This is global, and it looks like solar generation in terawatt hours is up ninefold. This is Energy Institute data, so the last actual was as of 2023. It's up ninefold. It's actually up more than that now. But look at this basket of publicly traded solar equities. This is measured by the Invesco Solar ETF, TAN, and it had done poorly during the first 5 years. And again, the actual growth was dramatic over those 5 years. Growth has continued. It looks like we had a post-COVID spike, pre-Biden peak, and then now it's been a straight line down. What's the lesson here? Maybe the publicly traded companies, I don't know them. Maybe they didn't have the best business models, but solar generation has only gone straight up globally. So other companies have done well. I'm aware of some private equity funds that are invested in solar generation, and I know one of them very well that has done well as a yield vehicle, as an example. So again, getting the business models right, it's not as simple as simply looking at the publicly traded companies. And the fact that capital may flow, may like or dislike whether ESG is in favor or out of favor, solar generation has only gone a straight line up, despite kind of a full cycle now on ESG. It's again, you'd be hard pressed to say who is in power during any of these periods. It's been one directional up and to the right. I've mentioned this point before. It's really what I think is going to be the biggest driver of new energies is the avoidance of oil imports in this case. So here we've got four countries. We got China in red, India in the mustard yellow, and then the dark blue line is the US. And then with Canada, US plus Canada is the light blue line. And of course, we meaning the US plus the help of Canada, have dramatically improved our net import position from being the world's largest oil importer in 2005 and 6 to now being a growing or modest net oil exporter. And I contrast that with China, which has clearly freaked out as they've merely gone from 1.5 barrels of oil consumption per capita to about 4 barrels of oil consumption per capita today. As a reminder, we're over 20, Canada's at 20, South Korea's at 22, Europe's at 10, Japan's I think 13 or 14. These are barrels of oil consumption per person. So China's still a fraction of that. And their oil imports are the largest in the world. That is their push towards electric vehicles. It is their push towards LNG trucks. And so we'll see how successful they are. They clearly have had success in ramping it. They've also had a significant GDP slowdown. I think that's been a huge factor in their oil demand growth slowdown, not just this transition to different vehicles. And I'm going to argue it is entirely driven by geopolitical security. My example is India. India today is at 5 million barrels a day. They're barely at 1.5 barrels of oil consumption per person. And again, we're at 20, Ritual's at 13, Europe's at 10. If India got to 10 barrels of oil consumption per person, it'd be 45 million barrels a day of oil demand, or at 44.5 million barrels a day of oil imports. There's zero chance they're going to want to get there. We can debate whether that would take 25 or 50 or 75 years. That's not the point. The point is that is going to be their motivation. And their oil demand is going to grow for the foreseeable future, but they're going to try for a shallower slope of line, which you can already see, and they're going to try and figure out what the alternatives are. That, to me, is the driver of new energies. And as these countries ramp, these are the good reasons, judgmental term there, admittedly, these are the good reasons to focus on new energies. What countries and their capital flows are going to suggest they should do. I think the last area I want to talk about in this topic of sort of energy and what it means for the environment and climate, again, I started off saying it's going to be up to the other 7 billion people on Earth to determine how they want to power their economies. And coal's a case in point. And so despite my comments just a slide ago, that I think there's going to be a strong motivation to avoid future oil imports. We'll see how successful they are. Most of these countries that are in the developing world have a whole bunch of coal. And you can see it has looked in the past like coal has plateaued a couple times. That's what these red circles are. And coal's made a new high as a new economy has developed, in this case, China. China's now half of world coal consumption. And what I think people should take a look at is this India line, which is way here at the bottom, but it's just starting to increase. If you care, if you are someone who is especially passionate about the climate, you might be upset that some IRA subsidy is going away. Maybe it should stay, maybe it shouldn't stay. Honestly, who cares? This is what matters. You got 7 billion people with a whole bunch of coal. Coal is reliable, affordable, domestic baseload power for these countries. And I think, I look at a country like India, they're gonna do a whole bunch of solar and batteries. I actually do wonder how much LNG are they gonna really want? There's some diversification benefits to them, but I'm somewhat suspicious that I think they're gonna do coal plus solar and batteries. They're gonna do nuclear. All of those are domestic resources for them. And they may top that off with some LNG from time to time, especially if the price is right. If you care about the environment, if you care about carbon emissions specifically, this is what matters. All those net zero graphs have coal rolling over. How? Why? Can you make coal cleaner? To what degree can you do carbon capture? To what degree are these countries going to be motivated to make it cleaner and do carbon capture? These, to me, are the much bigger climate or carbon considerations, especially if that's what you care most about, than, again, necessarily what happens in the United States, as an example. So the last area I want to talk about is just some of the corporate climate promises that were especially prevalent over the last 4 years. And so net zero by 2050 using scopes 1, 2, and 3, there were only a handful of traditional energy companies that did that. I think there was a greater number of non-energy companies that did it. For the ones in the traditional energy sector that frankly should have known better, oil, gas, and coal are 80% of primary energy consumption. That's a percentage that's barely changed over the last 20 years. The idea that in 25 years, by 2050, that number was going to come so far down that a whole bunch of companies could claim net zero, it was always ridiculous. How could you make such a promise as a company? This isn't hard math. So the oil companies, the handful of oil companies that had these scope 3, including scope 3 promises, they're all backtracking on them. I find it less forgiving because they should know energy. I'm a little more forgiving of the technology, industrial, and all these other companies that frankly I think didn't know any better, and that as they've done the math and as they've come to understand it, I think are coming to the realization that energy is far more complex than simple, even if it's catchy, kind of slogans. And I'll credit tech, I'll credit industrial companies with having increasingly done some good work on understanding all of this. And so net zero as a societal framework has never made sense. Promises by individual companies, I don't think has made sense either. The other big thing from the last 4 years, and this applied especially to the super majors or the big oil companies, is this idea that they should be partners in the energy transition. That's something we push back hard on. Our view is companies should invest in areas of competitive advantage. And frankly, a lot of the oil industry struggled last decade in the business they knew well. Why would anyone think it would make sense to go into some random new area? And there were prominent people at, I'm going to call it major oil consulting firms that put out, prominent oil supply demand statistics. Will be polite. They're prominent academics who all basically yelled at these companies, you really need to be partnered, strong partners for the energy transition. Absolute nonsense. These companies need to stick to what they know best. And there are some logical areas. I've highlighted it before. I've had respect for Total Energies' focus on integrated gas and power. It's something they're doing it in a way that I think is logical to their business model. I've mentioned the quartet of mid-cap oil services companies that are looking at distributed power. Again, given the nature of being a pressure pumping company, there's some logic to these companies evaluating those kind of businesses. And you have other examples of this. It doesn't mean companies shouldn't change. It doesn't mean they should stick their head in the proverbial sand, so to speak. You got to stick to your areas of competitive advantage. I think that is borne out in a big way. Near zero methane, mentioned it already, so I'll be brief. This is doable. Out of all the promises, this is one that we think companies should stick with. If we're being pragmatic, which is our stated title, if you're an American company, I don't think you can assume Republicans will have a permanent majority for the rest of the time. The history of this country suggests no, things swing back and forth. And this is actually one of these, I'm going to call it largely or almost entirely solvable type issues. Figure out how you're going to stick with it. Figure out what the, I think, self-regulation solution is. All companies are motivated to improve efficiency. And for a lot of companies, that means getting more output relative to unit of energy input. We talked about that at the societal or country level, improving your multiplier of GDP to energy input. This also applies at the corporate level of what as well. And whether that's directly carbon intensity is not always the case. And I think there can be reasons when you're doing acquisitions for why your carbon intensity could temporarily increase. I think it's a high motivation for the best run companies to be as energy efficient and overall efficient as possible. And that will increasingly correlate with decreasing carbon intensity. I think the last plea, this is going to call this more of a plea, is bettering these ESG reports. So, some people are really against any of the ESG reports. I don't take such a hard line for or against type of view. I've always used the underlying principles. I've always cared about governance as an example before anyone called it ESG. I always looked at who's on the board and does the management have a range of views? That might be the S. And I always cared about health, safety, and environment performance of my companies. And that mattered very directly. If you ran a refinery as an example, if you're in that business, I cared that they could run well, that you could generate profits when margins would rise or spike. So I've always cared about the underlying metrics. The problem with these ESG reports is, especially in the last 4 years, they fit into one or two buckets. They were either appeasement, and they read like, okay, I'm not as evil as you think I am. Not a fan of those ESG reports. I think the other bucket would be some sort of very earnest, here's all that we're doing. And I guess I have a little more sympathy to that. I've highlighted before, he's our current energy secretary, Chris Wright, but I know him as the CEO of Liberty Energy, bettering human lives. You don't have to like that report. Some of you don't like it. I love it. I know many people who like it. Some people don't like it. It's his articulation, it's Liberty's articulation for why they're in that business and why we need energy, and addresses a range of different factors. It's a positive statement on who they are. That if you're going to do ESG reports, Chris is a unique individual with a very unique speaking and writing style, and that's not for every CEO. But I am okay with articulating why you exist and how these types of metrics, governance and diversity of thought process, and who's at your company, and your health, safety, and environment sets, how they matter to your business. And how can we do this where it's actually a positive articulation of who you are, not especially the reports of appeasement, we're not as evil as you think you are slides that we had over the last couple of years. So I'd like to end this video on a personal note. And this past Monday, I had the good fortune, to join Liberty Energy to ring the opening bell for the New York Stock Exchange. It's something I've actually never done in my 33-year career, and I would like to thank Liberty specifically for inviting me. You can see in the picture here, the CEOs in the center, various board members and members of their management team, and then yours truly as you're looking at it on the far left. It was an absolute awesome experience. I grew up and still live in New York City suburbs. We used to take field trips when I was in elementary school to the New York Stock Exchange. And of course, working at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan before that, I'm not sure how I've never had this opportunity before, but if you get the chance, it is really a lot of fun. And it is actually quite emotional being there. I mean, it's, when you think about Wall Street, when you think about the importance of America's capital markets and how it has contributed to the greatness of our country, the New York Stock Exchange is as representative of that as any other institution. And the New York Stock Exchange, the people at the exchange who welcomed us and took us through the morning, they did a great job. There are still traders on the floor, fun to see and talk to them. And I absolutely loved it. Thank you, Liberty, for inviting me. Awesome experience. If you get the chance, definitely carve out time to do it. Ringing the bell on the New York Stock Exchange.